Episode 5. The trial unfolds in defense of a ninja. Let's once again journey back to early May 1987, where the prosecution has rested in the first-degree murder trial of Fred Freeman, accused of the brutal shotgun murder of college student Scott Macklem that prior November. Over the last few weeks, a St. Clair jury had been introduced to a variety of alleged eyewitnesses to the crime and listened to damaging, but sometimes conflicting, accounts of the events of the morning of November 5th, 1986. Additionally, they had heard key testimony as to the defendant's character, primarily from the victim's fiancée, Merrill, who had briefly dated Fred. Her scathing portrayal of Freeman as a manipulative and abusive individual who, according to her testimony, claimed to be a ninja warrior in a secret organization certainly must have stunned the jury, to say the least. The prosecution's case also featured the testimony of Phillip Joplin, a career criminal who contended that Freeman had nonchalantly confessed to the murder to him while the two were being held for a couple of hours in the same cell. But now, it was the defense's turn, and they had strong eyewitnesses of their own to present. Could a parade of purportedly unbiased individuals, several who, frankly, didn't even particularly care for Fred Freeman, counteract the impact of the prosecution's case? I am your host, Aaron, and this is Framed. Please join us for a close examination of Justice on Trial, the Temujin Kensu story. This is Episode 5, The Trial Unfolds in Defense of a Ninja. Primary research and writing for this podcast by Kathleen McGrath of Threadpillars Research. Music by the Captain of True Crime Garage. St. Clair County District Court, Port Huron, Michigan, May 12, 1987. The defense's main strategy in the trial of Fred Freeman would be to prove that no one, not even an alleged ninja, could literally be in two places at the same time. The approach centered on proving his alibi, arguing that he was hundreds of miles away from the crime scene at the time of the vicious, calculated murder of Scott Macklem. Fred's legal team also pointed to inconsistencies in the prosecution's witness statements, along with the absolute dearth of physical evidence linking him to the crime. In all, defense counsel would call a procession of witnesses who would confirm seeing Freeman on November 5, 1986 in Escanaba, a port city in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, as early as noon. This meant it would have been impossible for him to have been on the campus of St. Clair Community College in Port Huron at 9 a.m. Even breaking all speed limits, it would take, at minimum, 6 to 7 hours to drive from Port Huron to Escanaba. The defense aimed to show that the timing of the murder and the witnesses' sightings of Freeman in the UP made it virtually impossible for him to get to Port Huron, shoot the victim, and be back in time to be seen by multiple eyewitnesses. Even more impactful was the fact that these witnesses testifying for the defense were not necessarily friends of Freeman. In fact, according to some sources, a few of them didn't even particularly like Fred, yet they still testified in the defense of what they believed to be an innocent man. According to trial transcripts, the defense's case opened on May 12, 1987, with attorney David Dean challenging the legality of the search that had been conducted at Freeman's home on November 13, 1986. The conversation took place outside the presence of the jury. Dean informed Judge Corden that he'd initially been told that the warrant had been requested by Detective Hudson, but it was later clarified to him that Detective Bounds had issued it. Alleging that he'd requested a copy of the warrant from the prosecution, Dean said he was advised it wasn't available. However, Dean was able to obtain a copy of the warrant, labeled Exhibit H, and argued that it only authorized a search of the defendant, not the house. In other words, the warrant permitted police to locate Freeman and search his person, not to stage a wholesale raid of his home. Dean maintained that the Port Huron Police Department's actions on November 13, 1986, constituted an illegal search and seizure, rendering any evidence obtained as inadmissible. As many of us in the true crime community already know, this is commonly known as fruit of the poisonous tree. State Prosecutor Cleland, however, countered that the defense was indeed given access to the warrant well in advance of the trial and that the police report comprehensively outlined the events of the search. The court ultimately ruled Exhibit H to be admitted for the record, but not for consideration or determination by the jury. The judge reasoned that Dean's motion should have been put forth as a pretrial motion, not weeks into the trial. Once that matter was settled, the jury was brought in at 11:06 a.m. and the first defense witness was called to the stand. Kathleen Jacqueline Dyer took the stand, raised her right hand, and was sworn in to testify on behalf of the defendant. Kathy, as she was known, was a registered nurse and a Taekwondo instructor. She testified that she'd spoken with Freeman, who she knew as Mickey Ford, at 12:10 p.m. on November 5th at Chow's Black Belt Academy Karate School in downtown Escanaba. After positively identifying Fred in court as the person she knew as Ford, she described a brief, casual conversation about nutrition and health that the two had engaged in on November 5th at the karate school. Dean asked her if she was a personal friend of Freeman, and Kathy confirmed she was not. She explained that while she knew who he was simply a passing acquaintance she knew from the karate school, not someone she was close to or even saw socially. Trial transcripts reveal that in her direct examination, Kathy Dyer established herself as a highly credible witness. She provided detailed personal information, including her educational background and degrees earned in nursing, as well as her professional experience running the family business, a steel service center. With a stable and secure family life consisting of a husband and 2 children, Dyer appeared to be the epitome of a responsible and reliable individual. Furthermore, her description of her Taekwondo training and associated rank of Black Stripe suggested she possessed a disciplined and observant nature. Cross-examination by Prosecutor Cleland attempted to undermine Kathy's credibility. He began primarily by focusing upon minor inconsistencies in her statements and questioning the details of her recollection, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful. When challenged on cross that she may have gotten the date of the encounter with Freeman wrong, Kathy remained firm in her testimony. Explaining that she only taught in the school on Mondays and Wednesdays, she testified that she hadn't come in on Monday of that week. Therefore, it could only have been Wednesday, November 5th, that she ran into Freeman/Ford and spoke with him between 12:10 and 1 p.m. She clearly recalled speaking with him moments after her class had ended. After Kathy Dyer was excused from the stand, the next witness, Mark Sherman, corroborated her account with his own testimony. Sherman, who was also a student at the karate school, testified that he had attended Dyer's 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. class on that same day, and that he'd actually left a few minutes early. Given that Dyer had also recalled Sherman's presence in class and his subsequent early departure, and testified to speaking with Freeman after her class ended, this would imply both witnesses were recalling the same day, Wednesday, November 5th. Things were beginning to look up for Freeman, and the next witness that defense attorney Dean called would be pivotal to further bolstering Fred's claims of being hundreds of miles away from the crime scene, lending even more credibility to his alibi. His testimony to the highly controlled and disciplined nature of martial arts training would also help to alleviate the damaging accusations of Freeman's allegedly violent temperament. The next witness Dean called to the stand was Jonathan Sanford Manali, owner of Chow's Black Belt, the Escanaba Martial Arts Academy, at which Fred Freeman had been positively placed by several witnesses on the day of Macklum's murder. 28 years old and already a seasoned martial arts instructor with a military background, Manali's direct examination not only corroborated the testimony of the 2 prior witnesses, but it also established the highly disciplined and non-combative nature of the practice. Along with confirming Fred's presence at the studio on the date and time in question, his expert testimony revealed his extensive knowledge of various martial arts techniques and philosophies, all of which would have been crucial to Fred's training. His characterization of martial arts as having an emphasis on discipline and self-control directly countered the prosecution's arguments, accusing Freeman of unchecked, rampant violence. offering detailed descriptions of various martial arts weapons and their intended uses, provided a logical explanation of Fred's ownership of these items, suggesting they were for training purposes rather than for committing violent acts. Manali, too, testified to speaking with Freeman on November 5, 1986, between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. Manali clearly recalled his conversation with Freeman as the two had discussed the usefulness of a new product that had recently burst upon the martial arts scene and was currently all the rage among karate enthusiasts within the community. Chuck Norris, a renowned American martial artist and 80s action movie icon, had recently released a line of blue jeans called Chuck Norris Action Jeans, which were advertised as having been developed for stunt fighting. Manali distinctly recalled debating the effectiveness of the so-called kicking jeans with Freeman. This exchange stuck in his mind, leaving him completely certain about the exact timing of the discussion. During cross-examination, Manali would later contend that the prosecution asked him all manner of absurd questions regarding Freeman's so-called ninja skills, such as whether it was common practice to kill children with ninja throwing stars. Grilling him about the possibility of instantly killing an opponent with lethal martial arts techniques, the prosecution attempted to highlight the potential danger Freeman could pose. However, Manali patiently and carefully explained the context and conditions under which such techniques could be used, emphasizing the non-aggressive nature of his own teaching, as well as Freeman's generally controlled behavior in his classes. It should be noted that Fred's conduct and level of aggressiveness in class would be debated on recross. Manali later clarified that Fred was not a full-time student of his, but had attended a few of his classes while deciding whether to enroll. In Manali's opinion, their line of questioning seemed to come straight out of three popular movies of the day starring Sho Kosugi: Enter the Ninja, Revenge of the Ninja, and Ninja 3: The Domination. To his consternation and outright disbelief, the prosecutor quite seriously inquired whether or not Freeman could teleport or if he practiced mind control. Manali would later reveal that he had been stunned, absolutely dumbfounded by the tone of the questions, finding it impossible to believe they were genuine, especially considering the gravity of the situation Freeman was facing. He felt that the prosecution was clearly trying to capitalize on the media's enthusiastic adoption of the portrayal of Fred as a deranged ninja, an explosive accusation that was practically guaranteed to sell newspapers. Ninja movies were all the rage in the 1980s, and the people's questions appeared to be right out of central casting. On the whole, Manali's testimony could be perceived as a win for the defense, but on recross, Prosecutor Cleland did manage to score a point or two. He successfully persuaded the instructor to acknowledge his hesitation in accepting Fred as an official student. Not necessarily because of Fred's conduct in class, but due to certain associations he maintained outside of it. After Manali stepped off the stand at 3 p.m., defense counsel called their next witness, Paul DeMars. DeMars, a 17-year-old high school student who lived in Escanaba, testified to the jury that he was with Freeman, who he knew as Mickey Ford, in the early morning hours of November 5, 1986. DeMars told the courtroom that he'd received a call around midnight from Freeman/Ford on November 4th. Freeman said he needed help. His burgundy Mercury Grand Marquis had broken down in a restaurant parking lot and he needed a jump start. The younger man readily agreed to meet Fred in a parking lot of a Bob's Big Boy restaurant, also known as Elias Brothers, and lent him a hand. DeMars recalled that when he got to the restaurant parking lot, somewhat to his surprise, Freeman wasn't alone. Another person was with him, and it later became known that Freeman had been out on a date with high school student Beth Steer when the car broke down. On a related note, it would surface much later that Steer, who recalled knowing Fred as Nicky, had been interviewed by police in November 1986. However, this information was never disclosed to trial counsel in 1987, ultimately preventing Beth from testifying on behalf of the defendant. Beth had a clear recollection of the exact timing of the incident, as she remembered arguing with Freeman about it on the night of November 4th, when she glimpsed his driver's license that bore a different name than the one he'd given her. Her testimony would have been crucial to the defense, as prosecution witness Kruger testified to seeing Freeman on campus at 8:01 a.m., and she definitively placed him at the Big Boy restaurant in Escanaba, over 430 miles away, at 1:30 to 2 a.m. It seems highly implausible that Freeman would have dropped her off then raced to Port Huron in under 6 hours in a recently broken down vehicle to murder a man he claimed to have hardly known. On the stand, Paul DeMars recounted meeting Freeman at the lot, where they spent about an hour and a half trying to jumpstart the Marquis, eventually succeeding after fiddling with the air filter and the carburetor. Shivering with cold from the bitter November Michigan night, they went into the restaurant and ordered cream of broccoli soup to warm up, eating it in DeMars' car while they waited. Paul confirmed he last saw Freeman in the early morning hours of November 5th, around 1:30 a.m. He testified that he then saw him again later that same day at around 6:30 p.m., confirming that the two ran into each other before he went off to attend a Catholic catechism class that ran from 7 to 8:30 p.m. The following day, November 6th, DeMars said the two got together once more, going first to a shopping center and, after darkness fell, deer shining. Deer shining involved driving out to a field and using a spotlight to watch a herd of deer eating. Prosecutor Cleland cross-examined the teenager closely about the exact timing and details of the incidents he had outlined to the court, but DeMars remained steady in his testimony. Cleland further pressed Paul regarding his knowledge of Freeman's martial arts skills. DeMars acknowledged he was aware of and impressed with his friend's proficiency, but that the subject was not a topic of constant conversation between the two. DeMars' time on the stand ended on somewhat of a high note for the defense, when during redirect, Paul contended that Freeman was decisively anti-drug and not a big drinker. Moreover, he maintained he'd never heard his friend mention anyone named Crystal or Scott Macklem. He wrapped up his testimony by reasserting his claim of seeing Fred in both the early morning hours and later the same evening of November 5th, 1986, the very day of Scott Macklem's murder. Testimony from the defense's next witness, Jeffrey John McNamara, further bolstered Paul DeMars' account of the events of the night of November 4th into November 5th, 1986. McNamara, 23, was an Escanaba resident and an employee at Bob's Big Boy restaurant. He had been working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift on the night in question. He told the jury that he recalled Freeman and DeMars came in for a carry-out order of soup. After establishing that he was familiar with Freeman, having met him several times before this encounter, he testified that the men had arrived a little after midnight on November 4th or early November 5th. Describing some interactions with Paul DeMars, he agreed that he knew him as well. McNamara said that after initially acknowledging the two men, he paid little attention to them as he was busy with his various duties at the restaurant. His credibility as a witness established, McNamara explained that he typically worked 5 to 6 days per week, occasionally taking on 12-hour shifts. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Cleland pressed him about the amount of time he'd spent with the defense's investigator preparing for trial. McNamara estimated he spent no more than an hour and clarified that he regarded himself to be largely irrelevant to the case. He considered his role in testifying as simply one of verification. After McNamara left the stand, Defense Attorney Dean called 2 more key witnesses to testify on Freeman's behalf, Dash Edward Deal and Amy Cretin. Cretin and Deal, who were dating, were both students at the local high school. In his direct examination, 16-year-old Deal, an Escanaba resident, acknowledged knowing the defendant for about 6 months since late October or November. He stated that Freeman, who he knew as Mickey Ford, never used drugs. He also confirmed that Fred had not threatened him in any way. Deal clearly remembered running into the defendant on November 5, 1986, between 3 and 3:30 p.m., at which time the two discussed orange juice and junk food and talked about going to a nearby ski shop to purchase bindings. He explained that it was sort of an inside joke between them, since Freeman, a health nut, was opposed to junk food and sugary fruit drinks. Establishing that the defendant was not alone, he stated that Fred was with his girlfriend, who Deal referred to as Shelley. While Deal struggled with remembering some dates when asked about seeing the defendant after November 5th, the high school student did recall going deer shining with the group, which he thought had occurred either the night before or the night after the murder. After confirming that he'd been to one of Freeman/Ford's homes, his Lakeshore Drive residence, he testified that he'd never seen Freeman handling a shotgun. During cross-examination, Deal again described spending time downtown near Manning's ski and shoe shop and a gift shop, the Treasure Chest, providing details about store hours and locations. Deal reaffirmed the timing of the encounter, estimating that he'd seen the defendant between 3 and 3:30 p.m. on that particular day. Similarly, Amy Cretan's account echoed that of her boyfriend's. She stated that when school had ended at 2:45 p.m. that day, she and Deal walked to their friend Mike Olson's house and stayed there for about 15 minutes. They then walked to downtown Escanaba, where they bumped into Freeman, who she also knew as Mickey Ford, and his girlfriend, Michelle Woodworth, between 3 and 3:30 p.m. Running into each other on the sidewalk outside the Treasure Chest and Manning's, the four friends chatted for 15 minutes or so. Cretan noted in her testimony that the defendant did not appear to be tired or anxious, nor was he agitated or out of sorts. She also mentioned that the vehicle the couple had been driving was a big, gold Mercury Marquis. Fred would later clarify that the couple had owned two vehicles, the gold Mercury Marquis and the burgundy Mercury Grand Marquis, the one in which he had broken down on the previous night during his date with Beth Steer. He recalled the burgundy car being the good vehicle and the gold one, Michelle's car, was a beater. The day's testimony concluded with accounts by a trio of Kmart employees, as well as the statement of an auto parts store employee, Michael Burkholtz, Gene Lundquist, Patrick Kennedy, employees of Kmart, along with auto store worker Sean Deloria, testified that they either saw Fred's vehicle in the parking lot of a Kmart on the day of the murder or sold car parts to the defendant the next day. This happened after his burgundy Mercury Grand Marquis had broken down yet again at approximately 5 p.m. on November 5th. This time, the vehicle had conked out in the parking lot of the Escanaba Kmart. To avoid confusion, we need to go back and explain how Fred, who had been driving the gold Mercury Marquis the entire day in Escanaba, was now cruising downtown at the wheel of his other vehicle, the burgundy Grand Marquis. The situation is explained in Rabia Chowdhury's undisclosed podcast episodes on the case. Freeman said that after spending much of the day in Escanaba, he and Michelle drove back to their Rock farmhouse, which was about a 40-minute drive from downtown. After having driven the beat-up gold Mercury all day, Freeman wanted to retrieve the good car. His plan was to go home, clean up, switch over to the recently jumped burgundy Grand Marquis, and then head back to town to see a friend. However, right after he got back into town, the burgundy vehicle broke down again at around 5 p.m. at the Escanaba Kmart. Taking into consideration the time spent driving to Rock, cleaning up, changing cars, and driving back into town, this substantiated that he'd bumped into Dash and Amy at no later than 3 p.m. Furthermore, Freeman had witnesses and a signed, dated, and stamped receipt, as well as the testimony from the auto parts store worker and Kmart employees that clearly show his car was broken down in the parking lot of Kmart on the day of the crime. This would support Freeman's timeline as presented by the defense, making it impossible for Freeman to have committed the crime. In order to make the timing work, they implied, Fred would truly have needed to possess special ninja powers, as no mere human could possibly have achieved everything he was accused of and still have eyewitness confirmation of his presence at key moments. If you believe him guilty of the crime, he would have needed to drive to Port Huron after being confirmed as being seen at 1:30 to 2 a.m. on November 5th, as per Paul DeMars and Jeffrey John McNamara, who both testified, and later Beth Steer, who did not testify and was never asked to. That meant that after dropping Steer at her home after 2 a.m., he then would have had to drive like a bat out of hell in a recently jumped car, making the 6 to 7 hour drive to Port Huron. Arriving just in time to be spotted at 8:01 a.m., he'd proceed with his lethal plan, lying in wait and shooting the victim at about 9 a.m. Immediately afterward, and operating on no sleep, he would have had to turn around and immediately drive those same 6 to 7 hours back to Rock, switch cars, and, with Michelle in tow, drive into Escanaba in time to be seen at noon by at least 3 witnesses. If for some reason those witnesses somehow got the date wrong, 2 additional witnesses also recalled seeing Freeman in the gold Marquis and speaking with him at no later than 3 p.m. Then, apparently running on either fumes or otherworldly ninja power, he'd have had to drive back to Rock, drop off Michelle, clean up, switch vehicles, make the drive back to town, only to have the burgundy Marquis break down in the Escanaba Kmart parking lot at 5 p.m. After the statements of the Kmart employees, the day's testimony concluded. The defense, focusing heavily on Freeman's whereabouts on November 5, 1986, had almost certainly created a measure of reasonable doubt with witness after witness claiming to have seen Freeman at key times during both the night before and the day of the murder. But the following day, the people would present a unique theory and a rebuttal witness, one that aimed to explain the pesky timeline discrepancies revealed by the defense's statements. Initially, it seemed to be a desperate Hail Mary designed to counteract the strong witness testimony that surely must have created at least some skepticism towards the state's case. But would the jury think otherwise? St. Clair County District Court, Port Huron, Michigan, May 13th to the 15th, 1987. The following day, the morning's proceedings again opened with defense attorney Dean calling several more witnesses to the stand. A handful of experts testified with regard to phone records, SC4 campus parking lot security, military personnel on campus, and the prevalence of Army-style jackets, as well as a few more student eyewitness accounts that challenged the notion of both Freeman and his vehicle being present at the crime scene. Additional witnesses called by the defense included law enforcement professionals, including a latent fingerprint expert employed by the Department of State Police at the Madison Heights Regional Crime Laboratory, and Booker T. Brown. Brown was the individual in the holding cell with Freeman and Joplin who maintained that Freeman had definitively stated his innocence of the murder. The final witness for defense was Dr. Glenn J. Morris, a professor at Hillsdale College and an authority on ninja warriors and ninja culture, who was duly sworn in May 14th. During his time on the stand, Morris educated the jury on the rigorous discipline required to achieve a high level of expertise in martial arts, noting the many years of intensive physical and mental training involved. He also emphasized that the use of a shotgun would be highly uncharacteristic for someone who viewed themselves as having achieved ninja status, as they favored quieter, more traditional weapons. After Dr. Morris concluded his testimony and was excused from the stand, the defense rested. In all, Freeman's team had called 9 strong witnesses to support his presence in Escanaba at crucial times, timing that, if accurate, would have rendered it impossible for him to have killed Scott Macklem 436 miles away in Port Huron. The 10th unimpeachable witness, of course, should have been Beth Steer, the woman he was on a date with on the night prior to the shooting, but defense attorney Dean neglected to call her. Nor did he call Michelle Woodworth, who, to this very day, maintains that Freeman was in bed with her at the exact moment of the shooting. Following a short recess, the jury returned to the courtroom at 10:55 a.m. After confirming the presence of the jury, the court turned to the people for rebuttal. Prosecutor Cleland stated his intention to recall several witnesses, specifically Detective Bounds and Renee Gobine, for rebuttal. But first, he would present a brand new witness, Robert Lee Evans Jr. To counteract the impact of eyewitness testimony that Freeman was hundreds of miles away at the time of the shooting, Attorney Cleland offered what many considered a truly novel theory. He claimed that since Freeman was not seen between 1:30 a.m. and noon on the day of the murder, he could have conceivably flown from Escanaba to Port Huron, gunned down Macklem on the campus of St. Clair Community College, then flown back in time to be seen at the karate school in Escanaba at noon by several witnesses. This would neatly explain the inconsistencies in the timeline. The phantom airplane theory, as it came to be known, was a wholly unsubstantiated assertion that speculated that Freeman chartered a private plane from Escanaba to Port Huron to commit the crime, then flew back. According to the state's hypothesis, Freeman would have hired this mystery pilot in Escanaba to fly him round trip to the St. Clair County International Airport in Port Huron, after which he would have rented a car, committed the crime, and then made the return trip back in time to be seen by multiple witnesses at a karate school in Escanaba, where he was definitively placed on the day of the murder. This theory seemed to lack credulity, to say the least, since Freeman was in debt, flat broke, and struggled to pay his $200 monthly rent for the dilapidated farmhouse in which he and pregnant girlfriend Michelle Woodworth resided. he and Michelle relied upon welfare, supplemented by his vitamin sales and the occasional odd job to scrape by. Nevertheless, citing the existence of 23 landing fields and airports within a half hour of Port Huron, Cleland reasoned that Freeman, with his allegedly famous powers of persuasion, could have convinced a private pilot to fly him for a few $100s. To support this theory and testify that the timing was possible, he called Robert Lee Evans Jr., a non-commercial airline pilot, to the stand. Evans told the jury that yes, it was entirely feasible to fly between Escanaba and Port Huron in 90 to 100 minutes in a single-engine aircraft. But while establishing the claim to be theoretically possible, there was not one iota of evidence to imply that Fred Freeman had chartered a plane to commit the crime. The phantom airplane theory was, of course, pure conjecture. Not a single receipt, flight plan, credit card charge, landing location, or phone call would emerge to support this theory. In fact, there was no evidence at all to connect Fred to an airplane. There were no flight manifests or documentation associated with such a private round-trip flight occurring on this day. No record of Freeman ever chartering an aircraft or even making a phone call to inquire about what it would cost would ever be supplied. Additionally, the state was unable to produce the actual pilot who had conducted any flight even loosely resembling their description of what had occurred. Moreover, it was later discovered that Evans, the pilot who testified, was the friend and private pilot of none other than prosecuting attorney Cleland, a fact that was not revealed to the jury during trial. It later emerged that he routinely flew the prosecutor and other government officials around the state to their speaking engagements. Although testifying that the flight could conceivably have occurred within the prescribed time frame, Evans admitted that he was not the pilot with whom Freeman had allegedly made the trip. That person, assuming he existed, could not be located. The witness further contended that private pilots did not need to check in at airports, which would explain the lack of documentation. He also implied that pilots frequently hung around the airport, just waiting for a client to hire them for a short hop. It is interesting to note that in a December 2023 article for the Daily Mail, a former manager of the Delta County Airport in Escanaba said that he was never contacted by investigators at the time of the murder, and that during his tenure, it was highly unlikely that pilots would be waiting around the airport for someone to charter their plane. In a separate letter, a former fuel and maintenance manager at the St. Clair County Airport agreed with him. He conveyed that the notion of pilots hanging around county airfields in hopes of snagging a passenger was complete fabrication. Meanwhile, the same article relates that a flight instructor and commercial pilot who was friends with Robert Evans claimed he was not known for honesty. Labeling his friend as a really good storyteller, he claimed that everyone in Evans' circle knew that you had to fact-check what he told you. Back in the courtroom, it was established that a flight plan would not necessarily have been logged, as it was not required by law to do so at the time of Freeman's trial. This would account for the absence of a flight manifest. Robert Evans also allowed that the cost of a private charter would probably be closer to between $350 and $450 or higher, rather than just a few $100 as Cleland had implied. Note that some sources indicate that he testified to flights clocking in at $900 to $1,500 depending on the size of the plane. Regardless, any of these accounts might as well have been $10,000 for Freeman, who was constantly struggling to make ends meet and could barely keep his head above water. While defense attorney Dean was given the opportunity to cross-examine all the rebuttal witnesses and did so, the phantom airplane theory, now widely regarded as pure conjecture, had not been presented until rebuttal to the defense's case. Therefore, the defense was denied the chance to investigate and provide rebuttal of their own. After Evans was excused from the stand, Cleland recalled his other rebuttal witnesses. Trial testimony concluded, and the court recessed for lunch. The jury returned at 2 p.m., and it was now time for the closing arguments. Directly addressing the jury, prosecutor Robert Cleland presented his closing arguments first. He began by summarizing the case against Frederick Thomas Freeman, also known by the aliases John Lamar and Mickey Ford. Cleland underscored the devastating consequences that unfolded when the paths of two young people from rural Sanilac County, Bristol Merrill and Scott Macklem, intersected with that of the defendant, a troubled young man from Flint, ultimately resulting in Macklum's untimely and tragic death. Regarding the testimony of Crystal Merrill, Cleland again characterized her as an innocent farm girl who had been manipulated into circumstances beyond her control by an abusive, narcissistic charmer who presented her first with roses, then with threats. Highlighting the defendant's use of aliases and manipulative behavior in order to gain control over Merrill, the prosecutor stressed the importance of understanding Freeman's consistent patterns of psychological manipulation, physical and sexual assault, and his general disregard for the well-being of others. Prosecutor Cleland recounted his timeline of the events leading up to the murder, pointing to eyewitness testimony as to Freeman's presence on campus when the crime occurred. In addition to his own witnesses, Cleland addressed inconsistencies in the defense's alibi witness statements, highlighting discrepancies in their testimonies and lack of corroborating evidence. During direct examination of several witnesses, he effectively planted a seed of doubt regarding the possibility of any witness tampering by the defendant, countering the defense's arguments regarding the faulty license plate hypnosis, unsuccessful lineup identifications, and lack of a murder weapon. He emphasized the thoroughness of the investigation and the overall strength of the state's case, urging the jury to consider the cumulative evidence and find Freeman guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense then took the floor to deliver their closing arguments. Defense attorney David Dean began by criticizing the prosecution's focus on storytelling rather than concrete evidence, emphasizing the need for proof of motive, method, and opportunity. He pointed out that the state's entire case was based on suspicion and supposition, not evidence, declaring that there was not a single shred of evidence tying Freeman to the murder beyond the testimony of the supposed eyewitnesses and jailhouse snitch. He contended that the state had fallen far short of proving their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Dean reminded the court that no physical evidence had been presented that connected Freeman to the murder of Scott Macklum. A fingerprint found on a box of ammunition that was found next to Macklum's body did not match Freeman, and other evidence, such as the victim's gym bag, was not even tested. The defense challenged the reliability of the prosecution's eyewitness accounts, arguing that the timeline presented by the state was implausible. Discounting the people's theory of the crime as a love triangle gone terribly wrong, Dean maintained that his client, Frederick Freeman, had not even communicated with Crystal for several months before the murder. This would appear to exclude explosive jealousy and white-hot anger as the motive, given it would have been served decidedly cold. Further, Freeman categorically denied having any interactions with Macklum at all during the time he was allegedly stalking and terrorizing them both. Regarding Crystal's accusations that Freeman had raped, beaten, and coerced her, Dean suggested that these were entirely false allegations. He noted he found it odd that she did not tell anyone after suffering such a traumatic violation, nor did she stop seeing Freeman. He questioned the credibility of her testimony, suggesting that perhaps she too had fallen prey to the sensationalized and exaggerated aspects of the portrayal of Freeman as a ninja warrior. Criticizing the prosecution for allowing it, he argued that Crystal's claims of Freeman hiding out in bushes, listening in on her conversations, and throwing ninja stars were unsupported by any eyewitness other than herself. Dean concluded his argument by probing the jury as to why Freeman would bother to wait several months after breaking up with Crystal, then come back to murder Macklum. Acknowledging that Freeman was, perhaps, not the nicest guy in the world, he cautioned the jury against convicting someone just because he is not a nice guy. Dean disagreed that the investigation was thorough and diligent, suggesting that instead it was sloppy and rushed, possibly due to the upcoming elections in November. We know that Port Huron detectives had zeroed in on Fred Freeman based on a few offhand comments by Crystal and her sister at the hospital, and in law enforcement's eyes, they had their suspect. Citing a lack of concrete evidence, Dean argued that a more detailed investigation could have revealed the true killer and provided justice for Scott Macklum and his family. After summarizing his thoughts, Dean reminded the jury that rather than being swayed by the sensationalized accounts offered by the prosecution, they should instead consider reasonable doubt. Once again emphasizing the lack of corroborating evidence and the inconsistencies of prosecution witness testimony, Dean reiterated that the jury needed facts, not assumptions, beyond a reasonable doubt, before convicting Freeman of first-degree murder. Lacking those facts, they would have no choice but to find his client not guilty. Ultimately, closing arguments presented two essentially different interpretations of the same evidence. The state emphasized the cumulative weight of circumstantial evidence and eyewitness testimony, advising jurors to connect the repeated accusations of Freeman's manipulative and narcissistic behavior with the premeditated, calculated crime. Conversely, the defense focused upon challenging the credibility of supposed eyewitnesses, highlighting inconsistencies in the timeline, and emphasizing the lack of direct physical evidence, while offering alibi witnesses of their own. Now that all of the evidence had been presented and arguments in the case were completed, the case was ready to be handed to the jury. On May 15, 1987, Judge Corden instructed the jury, reminding them of their sworn duty to consider the facts of the case. Offering concrete examples, the judge clarified the differences between direct and circumstantial evidence and the value of both. He admonished them that if the direct and circumstantial evidence supported opposing verdicts of innocence and guilt, they must find in favor of the defendant. Regarding the prosecution's burden of proof, which is higher in criminal cases than in civil ones, he cautioned them that if they were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, after considering all of the evidence, they must acquit the defendant. Frederick Freeman's entire future now hung in the balance, entrusted to the 12 jurors who had listened intently for several weeks to the contradictory and sometimes contentious arguments on either side. But whose truth would they ultimately believe? Next on Framed Season 3. On May 15, 1987, 12 jurors were charged with determining the guilt or innocence of Frederick Freeman in the first-degree murder of Scott A. Macklem in Port Huron, Michigan. The St. Clair Community College sophomore, who was engaged to Crystal Merrill, a woman Fred had briefly dated, had been mercilessly gunned down in the student parking lot just 6 months earlier. The state's theory relied upon the jury believing that Freeman, 23, was a violent, manipulative, self-proclaimed ninja warrior who was consumed by jealousy and rage. With an unrelenting need to control his former girlfriend by any means necessary, the prosecution maintained Fred deliberately ambushed and executed his unsuspecting victim as he arrived on the campus. The state had presented 30 witnesses, several of them eyewitnesses who placed Freeman near the scene to support their theory. However, the defense countered that this was pure fantasy and that Freeman was actually 436 miles away in Escanaba at the time of the murder, and they were able to provide a series of equally credible eyewitnesses to prove it. After nearly 3 weeks of harrowing, emotional testimony on both sides, it was now up to the jury to reach a conclusion. Would Freeman walk out of the courtroom as a truly free man, or would he spend the remainder of his life in prison?